So as I had mentioned this morning to Caitlin and Carol, is that I've been in extension a number of years now, and there were a lot of clients coming in with questions about their trees, and a lot of times some of the problems that are associated with them had to do with people maybe doing something wrong to begin with, maybe put their trees at risk for dying. And I know it wasn't their intention to kill the tree, but those mistakes are made. And so this is really kind of a marriage of my two interests, landscape design and my arborist designation. So it's really about bringing those together so that we do the best things for our trees. And you know, why do we want to protect our trees? Certainly there's times where, you know, we're looking just at things from the economic standpoint. You know, it's adding to our property values. You know, if a nice tree is there, it also makes your house more marketable somewhere down the road. But really, trees are representations of time, and they're representations of time that we can't get back. Somewhere in the past, somebody planted something knowing that they'll never probably really be able to enjoy that tree, and they really did it for future generations. And so, for instance, when you have like a 100-year-old bur oak in your yard, and that's a point of pride and value to your landscape, then it doesn't make sense to do things that could potentially question whether that tree will survive or not, because even if what you did killed the tree and you came and purchased the largest tree you could from a garden center, you know, that's still not going to be the size of the tree that was in that spot. And so really it's a tremendous amount of time that we're looking at when we're looking at trees in our landscape. A lot of times we put them in to commemorate some type of event, you know, a birth or a marriage or something like that. And so there's a lot of sentimental value that we place on those trees, and doing the right things by them to make sure that they stick around is a good thing. Then there's the practical things, you know, so if it shades your house, it saves on energy costs to cool your house in the summertime. In this case of this particular tree, it enhanced the views. So the house on this particular property is a little bit, it's in the foreground and it's to our right. And the architect, when they designed the house, he actually managed everything so that the main windows of the house overlooked this gorgeous hackberry tree. I know hackberries aren't ones that we necessarily think of as gorgeous, but in this case it was. I mean, it was a beautiful, beautiful tree. And so it can really enhance our views when we have gorgeous trees in our landscapes. And then, of course, unfortunately, we have some things where we want that screening. You know, we don't want to be seeing into the neighbor's yard, or there's something terrible going on in the property next door, and we don't want to see that either. So trees are really good about screening their views for us. And then there's a lot of research now that indicates that, you know, it adds to our quality of life. So, you know, 2 patients in the hospital, one looking out over a tree from their window, heals faster than another person with a similar ailment that's looking out over a brick wall or something like that. So there's a tremendous value that we have on trees that far exceed our ability to quantify it in one sentence. It's a big thing to make sure we're doing the right thing by them. So with that experience I have in talking to a lot of clients about trees, there's really 3 very predominant myths that people hold and they bring to the table when they're discussing their tree issues. And so people don't understand that you know, certainly an older tree can weather more problems, but there's never, you know, a get out of jail free card where you can do something really nasty to a tree and the tree will take it just fine. So you're going to hear me talk a lot about these different things that are missed when it comes to trees. And so let's go over those. Okay. And one of those myths is that trees grow downward. And typically what people thought is if you took the crown of the tree and you turned it upside down, that's what the root system looked like in the ground. And so you can see the depiction in this diagram on our left, more or less that's the tree canopy turned upside down. Well, that's not wrong. And imagined is a good word for that, because that's not how tree root systems develop. Real tree roots are much more like the ones on the right. Here's an even better image of what that looks like. So tree roots are primarily in the top 18 inches of soil. I'll talk about why that is in just a moment. There's a few big anchoring roots, but the vast majority spread out very horizontal to the soil surface and a good 1.5 times beyond the tree canopy. So you can see how with a root system this extensive, that things that we do to dig up or move around soil or whatever around a tree can be quite disruptive. And the thing is that while the anchoring roots do just that, they anchor the tree, the real workhorse of a tree root system is in these very lateral roots that spread out very parallel to the soil surface. The vast majority of the hair-like root sections are the ones that are really responsible for the uptake of water, the uptake of nutrients, and other things like that. So this gives you a clear idea of where that root system is. And once we have a clear idea of where that root system is, we're less likely, hopefully, to do things that will harm that root system. Okay. Another idea that comes out of this is that, if the tree roots have water, everything else will fall into place and everything's good. And that's not true. Okay, so besides water, tree roots respire. In fact, all plant roots respire. So that means they take in oxygen to complete the functions that they need to do, and they give off carbon dioxide as a waste gas. Now that's the exact opposite of what we expect from everything above the soil line, because that's the exact flip of what the trees do. They actually take in carbon dioxide and give off oxygen. So tree roots need that exchange of gases at the root zone to take place. And then nutrients that happen to be dissolved in the water that's in the soil then get moved up into the tree as well. And that's how the tree takes in a lot of the nutrients it needs. Finally, tree roots need space, okay? And I like to tell people that, tree roots don't grow in the soil, they grow in the spaces in the soil. And so if there's not many spaces in the soil, then that means that tree root system is going to be stunted. And that stunting manifests itself on above ground features of that tree. And as I had mentioned earlier, oxygen is most available in that top 18 inches of soil, okay? And that's why you see tree roots occupy primarily that top 18 inches of soil, is because that's where the oxygen is. That's what they need to survive. And so that's why it's important that we keep that in mind of where that root system is. So when we look at ways that there's a lack of air in a soil, there's several factors that can occur. Most notably and most notoriously is equipment. Equipment can really compact a soil. A lot of times heavy equipment running over a construction zone area. You'll see the paltry little orange fences that they'll put around the drip line of a tree, and then it falls over and the tree's root system gets driven over, or worse yet, the construction workers park their trucks under there because it's cooler under there, right? And so that's a big factor when it comes to compaction. Excessive fill. So in this particular instance, a new road was put in place, and at least they were cognizant that, the trees couldn't handle having the excess soil put up right near their bases. But really, this retaining wall structure isn't anything to really keep those roots healthy. If you look at it from a practical side, you know, well over 90% of this tree's root system is buried under more than just a little soil. And that means then that any of those roots that were towards the bottom of that 18 inches are now even further away from their oxygen source. And so they're not getting oxygen. If they're not getting oxygen, those roots start to die. Once those roots are dead, that's going to have a manifest effect on the canopy of the tree, and you'll see a reduction in canopy. And in essence, these kind of things, we call them tree coffins, because those trees, I mean, our intentions are the best they can be, but they're really not enough to make certain that these trees survive. So excessive fill is a huge issue. A lot of times the mulch we use and the landscaping fabric that we put underneath it are problems because, again, they put that root system, those ones at the bottom of that 18 inches, even further away from their oxygen source. And so that can be an issue associated with that too. And I would just like to talk a little bit here about tree anatomy. So the tree trunk has very different tissues that function within the tree, and the roots have a very different type of structure within them. And where the trunk and the tree roots come together is called the zone of differentiation. And that zone of differentiation means that okay, here's the crown of the tree. Up above this is going to be the trunk, and below this is the root system. And each of those tissues have evolved over millennia to function in very different ways. And the trunks have evolved to being in air, in sunlight, in wind, all of those very rough characteristics that bark is well suited to protecting those tree trunks. On the other hand, the root system has evolved to being in the highly competitive environment of soil, flora, and fauna, the microorganisms that break things down, decompose things. And so they have a defense system that makes them well suited to being in contact with the soil. And so when we put things up on the trunks of trees, we've just immediately confused issues tremendously. So now we have a trunk that's in that moist, highly microorganism amount in that environment, and we're expecting them to not start decaying. And that isn't what happens. Those trunks start decaying almost right away. And I've actually gone through neighborhoods after storms and looked at trees that were either had soil dumped around the base or had the mulch too high. And the trees that broke, they literally broke at that point where that decay was taking place. So it acts like a fulcrum, and that tree comes down and it breaks at that weak point, which is where that trunk is at the base. So just so you're aware of that, that's the issue that's associated with having too much mulch, okay? And then a tree's too deep. So it's too deep either at planting time, somebody's just put it in too deep into the ground, or in some cases, fill was brought in and dumped all over that root zone area. And it's always clear when a tree is too deep, when it goes into the ground, much like a telephone pole. So if you're not seeing that flare where the tree trunk meets the root system, that means that zone of differentiation, which is separating those two types of tissue, is now confused, because now we have a trunk tissue that's below the soil line. And so those are all things that factor into less air at the root zone and cause stress to trees. So the interesting thing about it is that the foresters share with us that there's usually a 4 to 5 year lag on any time there's a stressor event. And stressor events can be something like a flood, you know, that impacted that particular tree, or if there was a drought. And so that means that the tree is going to be dealing with those issues 4 to 5 years from when that initial stressor event occurred. And so that's critical to know that, because a lot of times a tree owner will do something wrong for the tree, and the tree doesn't immediately die that very day or the next day or the next week, and they think they got by with it, when really they didn't get by with it, because there are some indicators that are going on with that tree that tell us what is happening there. But we, as a lot of lay people out there, don't know what that is that we're looking at and what those problems can be. And I like to look at the branches themselves. The branches will tell the story of, reduced growth. So on this particular branch, this end bud to the far right here, that's where a particular branch stops growing in a given year, and then the following spring begins growing, all right? And it leaves behind something called a bud scale scar. And that scar is usually characterized by lots of little ridges encircling that branch at that point. And so you can go backwards on a branch and look at the annual growth on that branch and just see how much annual growth has been going on with a particular branch. And if you're seeing a reduction, so the brackets at the bottom show that, initially on the older part of the branch, it was pretty decent growth, and then it's gradually lessening. And if you're seeing that occur, you have to ask, why is that occurring? Because something's going on here, that the tree is voluntarily slowing its growth. I actually had a client come in that the master gardeners and I were trying to help a woman that she had it was probably about 100 years old, concolor fir in her landscape. So she found an image from when the house was built 100 years ago, and there was this little tiny concolor tree. And 100 years later, this tree was 70 feet tall. It was a massive, gorgeous tree, and it was showing signs of stress. And so she had brought a branch, and we were looking at it, and you could see that about 4 years ago, the tree had a good 6 inches of growth in a given season. And then it came to like 3 inches of growth, and then 2 inches of growth, and then it was doing just an inch of growth. And so it was clear from that large growth to the smaller growth that something roughly 4 years ago had happened to the tree. And so I asked the client, what had gone on with that tree roughly 4 years ago. Was it in some kind of storm, something like that? And she looked at us like we were miracle workers, that we would even ask that question, because 4 years ago, they had put a massive patio in the backyard of their house, and this patio completely encircled around this concolor fir. And so the tree went from having a root system that was regularly watered by Mother Nature to having almost no water at the root zone area. And when you think about pavement, a lot of times that top 4 to 5 inches is pulled away. So any roots that are unlucky enough just got torn away in that top 4 to 5 inches. And then they come through and they compact the soil, because they don't want that concrete to heave. And so they'll compact that soil. And so any roots that are lucky enough to be left behind are now unlucky enough to be compacted. And then the concrete is poured. And so it's gone from a pervious area to an impervious area. And that set the tree up for some significant problems. So those are the kind of things that you can look for, that there's indications that the tree is giving you that it's under some stress. And you can see that the first growing season after something like this occurs. And then there's secondary problems. So, and I have, this is oak anthracnose. Typically, we don't see it give trees any real problems. An older, mature tree can handle having oak anthracnose absolutely fine, and it won't kill the tree. But sometimes what we see happen is that if there's initial problem that has occurred, then something that's minor or secondary will then seek to finish the tree off. And this is another story that has to do with oak trees, is that A client called in, and they had 3 100-year-old bur oak trees that were situated in their landscape. And when they built the house, when they built the deck, everything was to take in these magnificent bur oak trees. And after they were done, as they do with most construction projects, they came in and they regraded, and they dumped roughly 12 inches of soil around all these trees' root systems. And the trees were now starting to show signs of stress from anthracnose. And the client was wanting to have the tree injected with the fungicide for the anthracnose, and the master gardener who was dealing with the question was trying to get him to understand that he predisposed his trees to having ash anthracnose because of all the soil that was dumped around the trees. So that's a key characteristic. And when he was trying to get that idea across to the client's response was that, what, and kill all my turfgrass? So in the scheme of things, you know, it takes longer to grow trees than it does grass. It makes sense to do things right by the trees from the get-go. Okay, so that I was a little bit on my soapbox there. So there's some steps that we could take for healthy tree roots, and these are common across all types of trees, and they're considered best management practices. So we want to avoid bringing in soil and dumping it over the root system, and we want to avoid excavating around root systems. We want a 2 to 4 inch layer of organic mulch. That's an ideal amount. And we don't want it piled up right against the trunk base. We want to avoid using landscaping fabric or plastics of any kind. This can really mess up the tree's ability to take in oxygen, can also mess up the water percolation that needs to take place there. If you've ever pulled up landscaping fabric, try to remove it. You know, the soil's very slimy underneath there. And so that's an indication that if it's not a great soil environment, it's probably not a good root environment either. We want to avoid heavy pruning. Now that may sound counterintuitive, but the thing is that we know that one root takes care of more than one branch up in the canopy. And so what that means is it takes several branches to support that root that's in the ground. So the root's providing water up to those branches. The branches are providing those products of photosynthesis, in this case carbohydrates, and sending them down to the root system. And so it's a mutually agreed upon transaction here that's taking place. And so if we're doing some heavy pruning, we're decreasing the amount of carbohydrates that are moving into the root system to help sustain those efforts that the root system is doing. We want to have about 1 inch of water per week. That's irrigation and precipitation combined. And if you're irrigating, that water needs to be put down all in one sitting. So it can't be a 1/2 inch here and a 1/2 inch there. It needs to be 1 inch all in one sitting to really get that deeper roots moist. Dicamba is a herbicide that's commonly found in combination products. And combination products that have dicamba in them, we know that dicamba gets stored in tree tissues. And there's a critical amount of when the dicamba surpasses the tree's ability to survive having that dicamba stored in it. So it's not, you know, trees are not like us in that we can get rid of impurities through our system. Trees instead have to store things that they don't need, and that can get to be a critical amount at some point in the future. So dicamba is a real issue there. And then really we need to separate the trees from the turfgrass. Everybody likes the park-like setting that when those are together, but their trees and turfgrasses needs are very different from one another. And I'll talk more about that a little bit later. So here's a diagram of what wood chip mulch does for trees. Remember what I said earlier about the hairs, the root hairs are the workhorses of a tree root system. you can see that on the left, tree roots under a turfgrass area, there's very few of them. There's just not a lot there. And that's because there's a competitive environment there. The turfgrass and the trees are competing with one another. Whereas on the right, a tree that's mulched will have many, many more of those single-celled root hairs that are projecting from that root system. And so that's a healthier root system that's there. When we mulch, we're replicating what goes on the forest floor. That accumulation of twigs and leaves and other material is called duff, D-U-F-F. And we know that tree roots function better under that duff layer. And so when we're mulching, we're really replicating what Mother Nature is doing to have the best tree root system. We know that mulch keeps the soil cooler in the summer, and that's critical because we know that when soil temperatures get above 85 degrees Fahrenheit, tree root function stops. So water intake stops when soils get hot. And so if we can keep those soils cooler, we're going to keep those trees functioning better. We know that sometimes our winters don't always have that decent snow cover that we need, and snow cover is really good mulch. And so when we don't have that, it's nice to have that buffer in between the air and the soil, and that's what mulch does. It buffers those deep temperature drops. And a lot of times people complain about using mulch because it decomposes and they have to add to it over time. But I say that's the good thing about it, because then what you're doing is you're nutrient cycling, you're providing nutrients to the plant, and you're making that soil a better quality. It helps us to keep the soil moisture, keeps our weeds down, and it really keeps that grass competition farther away. And when we keep that grass further away, we're less likely to hit trunks with weed whips and with string trimmers and mowers, okay? So how do you go about landscaping around established trees? Well, we'll go through all of these things on my bulleted list here. So let's start with the protected root zone, also known as the PRZ. This is the minimum amount of space that really needs to be protected from any kind of construction activity. And remember how far out the root system really goes, another 1.5 times beyond that canopy. So keep in mind that this is the minimum. If you can stand to go out even further when you're protecting a root zone, then this is going to be better for the tree. So if we think about impervious surfaces like concrete and asphalt, you know, some of these mortared in place walks, those kind of things don't let water through them. And so we can actually have trees that are greatly drought stressed in those types of situations. We also add something called the heat island effect. And that's when the pavement absorbs the heat all the day long during the summertime. And then at night when the sun goes down and the green parts of the landscape are cooling off, those areas with impervious surfaces are continuing to dissipate that heat around the plants well into the night hours. And so that's a concern. And so pervious paving is always a good thing in order to help trees get the water they need. So the image on the left, those are just stone pieces that you create a bench spot and an inviting path to that bench spot. Water can still get into and around, and it really doesn't take up a lot of space. On the right, the pervious paving, I'm sure you've probably seen some of these things before where water literally percolates through those types of surfaces. And so that may be something to consider as well if there's any kind of pavement, solid surface paving that you want to do, but you want to allow water in. So a lot of times when we have an established tree and we know we want to put in some kind of garden at the base, the first order of business is to start with smaller size nursery stock. So if you're thinking you want a shade tolerant shrub to put under a situation like this, rather than purchasing the 3-gallon size of the shrub, you're going to opt for the 1-gallon size, just to make sure that you can shoehorn it in to a spot where there isn't roots to get those plants off to a start without having to destroy the tree's root system. If ever you run across a root that's bigger than an inch in a given area, the last thing you really want to do is sever that root just to get that plant in. That's going to cause some issues. And if you are severing a root that's smaller than an inch, then you're going to want to make sure that that's a nice clean cut. So if your spade is really chopping up and messing up the end of that root, you want a nice clean cut so that the tree can callus over that end root better. And then you can always opt for plants that just do really well in dry shade. So Vinca minor, Vinca major, Baltic ivy, those are all examples of shade tolerant plants that don't mind that it's dry there as well. And so those can be some of the options that you look at. And unfortunately, I have too many images of raised beds. So clearly, you can tell that this raised bed is fairly recent, mostly because the grass is just getting off to a start here. But when you look at the tree, you have a pretty good idea of how much fill has been brought around the base of that tree. And so that zone of differentiation where trunk material is meant to be in air and sunlight is now violated. There's decay going on around the base of that tree that wasn't happening before. So this particular tree, the tree owner had 2 pin oaks in the yard, and in the fall of the year, hired a landscaper to come in and put in these gorgeous raised beds around the tree. And the following spring, the tree, both trees failed to leaf out altogether. Everything else was leafing out. These trees did not. And I will tell you that it's unusual for us to see a tree die that rapidly from something like this, but it's not unheard of. And oaks tend to be the ones that are most resistant to this kind of problem. So what this owner ended up with was absolutely gorgeous raised beds and dead trees. So raised beds create a lot of problems. And oftentimes the owner doesn't even equate what had happened in the past to what's causing the problem now. There's a common saying that a colleague has is that trees don't die when they're killed. So the tree was actually killed when the raised bed was put around it. It really didn't die until the following spring. And so gives you an idea of the lag that it happens. And in fact, when the inquiry was sent in for this particular tree problem, the person was saying, you know, everything's fine, everything's good. I don't understand why this is happening. And oh, by the way, this bed was put in last fall. So it wasn't even a cause and effect in this person's mind. So raised beds are a huge issue. And unfortunately, when we see one person doing it on their block, we always see multiples of that occur. And that's just a really bad thing for the trees overall. A lot of trees over time will have roots that come to the surface. It's either the natural tendency of that tree species to do that, or it could simply just be growth. So you know how the tree trunk grows in girth over time? Tree roots do that as well. So any of those tree roots that are closer to the soil surface, as they grow in girth, they're going to pop ever more above that soil line. And the last thing that you want to do is come in with the mower and scalp those roots, because that's not helpful to the tree at all. That's a place for decay organisms to get into the tree. And so where possible, if you can mulch the tree around the base, You know, what I really like about this tree on the left is at least you know that that tree was planted at the proper depth. You're seeing that root flare or crown flare, whatever you want to call it, that's there, and that's an indication that that tree is well planted. So looking at the image on the right here, you can see that you can go with simply mulching, or you can take it one step further and maybe even put hostas or something like that around them. So I had mentioned earlier about separating trees and turf grass. If you look at the things that are in our landscape, so things like trees and shrubs and perennials and ornamental grasses, all have similar needs. They like to have about 1 inch of water per week. It's best if that 1 inch is applied all in one sitting. Our turf grasses, on the other hand, are very different than that. Their root system is comprised in the top 6 inches of soil. And a lot of times if we have an irrigation system, it's zoned for taking care of the turf grass first. And in this particular instance, that separation of trees and turf grass really isn't enough. That tiny little mulch ring of rocks around the base really isn't enough. And so really what's going on here is that the turf grass looks absolutely gorgeous. Probably there's an irrigation system here that's watering for the turf grass and not the tree. And the tree does not appreciate being watered 2 or 3 times a week during the hottest part of summer. They're just not going to do well in those conditions. Another thing I want you to make note of is just how weed-free this lawn is. And so when you see a lawn that's that weed-free, you have to ask, you know, what kind of herbicides are being used in order to keep things that clean? It's a possibility that dicamba was one of the issues here. So this is something that further emphasizes that we really need to keep these sets of plants apart because they have very different needs. And so this image is a depiction of massing the plants together that have similar needs. You can do a drip system for these trees and shrubs, whereas the turf grass can go to like an impact head to water that if necessary. We really want to stay away from adding soil around a root system. So in the graphic image on the top left here, we can see that rather than just dumping a bunch of soil around the base of the tree, what we can do is we can create a retaining wall. So at the minimum, the protected root zone doesn't have a bunch of soil dumped around it. And so on this image on the far right here, I mean, this yellow tape is really not helping anything. So there's just so many different things. These trees are, in essence, pots in the ground because you've got a paved surface to the clear right. It looks like you have a road that's being traveled by heavy machinery, and now you have a bunch of soil that's dumped around the root system. So this is just, you know, a situation, a lose-lose situation altogether. And then soil excavation. So rather than coming through and just chopping away at everything, we can create retaining walls that again protect that root zone area so that at a minimum we're keeping out of that area. And a lot of times when the utility companies are coming in and they're trenching to put in lines, this is really, really tough when they come right by a tree. I actually had a client come in one time where the tree was only 3 feet from where the trench was dug to put in the utility box. And at the time, the utility company told them that that trench would not harm the tree at all. But if you think about it, if tree roots occupy the top 18 inches or so of soil, then on the left side of this tree, all of those roots have been severed. And so now we're looking at a structurally unstable tree. And a good or snow load could really make a difference here as to whether that tree stands or not. And so the best possible thing would be some kind of a borehole where the cable is put through that borehole rather than a trench that just simply cuts everything. So we don't think of trees as being, you know, aerodynamic, but they are. They've put tree branches and tree leaves into wind tunnels, and trees respond to that based on the predominant winds of the area. And so whenever we want to thin the trees, I always urge clients to think twice about that, because you know, you're changing the aerodynamics of the tree. The tree that used to be able to stand up on its own may come into question, because now snow loads are hitting it differently than it has in the past. The wind is hitting it differently than it has in the past, and that could structurally bring those trees down. And when you think about dappled sunlight, plants that have evolved over millennia to do well in that dappled sunlight have a different physiology than plants that need full sun all the time. So that dappled light, as it dances across the leaves of hostas and other shade-tolerant plants, those plants are able to gear up to massive photosynthetic level in that brief time that the sun dances over that leaf surface, and then they shut down again once they're back into shade. And so that's a very specialized mechanism for photosynthesis that our turf grasses just don't have. And so a lot of times when people are trying to grow turf grass under a tree, and it's really 3 hours of direct, uninterrupted sunlight. Dappled sunlight doesn't count, that those tolerant species need. So if you're talking about the chewing fescues or the red fescues, the ones that are really tolerant of shade areas, even they need 3 hours of direct sunlight daily. And if they're not getting that, then that's really an effort and futility, because you're always going to be having to oversee that area just to keep a stand there. And so that's a critical issue. And people that think that they can thin out a tree canopy enough in order to have that turf grass grow, a lot of them end up killing the tree, mostly because they thin too much in order to get that turf grass to grow, or some other event brings the rest of the tree down. So if you're thinning just to be thinning, rethink that thought, because there's a lot of information out there that indicates that that's not the way to go. And if you're really having to grow something near the base of trees, go with something entirely different, like hostas or ground covers or something like that. So these were the I went through for having happy trees. Ultimately, we want to see a marriage occur where we're having healthy trees and beautiful landscapes occurring, even retroactively, even if trees have been in for a long time and landscapes come in later, because those two together really bring up the aesthetic quality of a landscape, and they add a lot of dimension to a space. So these are things that you want to keep in mind. And with that, if anybody has any questions.
Kathleen, I learned a lot. We don't have any questions yet in the chat box, but people that are watching, if you have questions, please go ahead and put it in. I did see Caitlin put the copy of the evaluation in there. And this last picture is interesting. So it has something that you've actually put into the tree. Right. Is it okay to do?
It is okay to do that.
Okay.
Yes. So if it's a healthy tree to begin with, the tree's going to handle having this just fine. What I don't want to see people do, and what a lot of people mistakenly believe is okay to do, is to wrap something around the trunk and affix that hammock in that way. And that's not what you want to do, because over time, remember how that tree trunk grows in girth? Eventually that rope or whatever it is that's wrapped around the tree can girdle that trunk. And then what happens is that the tree dies from that point upward. And so it's by far friendlier to put in something like an eye bolt into that space. The tree will develop callus roll over that spot. And in a tree this size, it's not even going to bother it at all. So that's a key issue. Even things like swings that are in trees, even if those could be checked every other year, at least, to make sure that the ropes that are on it aren't getting too tight, would be a good idea, just so that you don't accidentally kill a branch.
Interesting. If anybody does have a question, please go ahead and write it in the chat. I definitely noticed some things that I have done wrong in the past and hope not to do again. We do have a question, it looks like. Can the mulch area under a tree be smaller than the full diameter of the tree? And I'm thinking they're talking about the drip line.
Yeah. So a lot of times, if people have small yards and they don't want to give up a lot of their turf grass to the tree, I always tell them that the minimum is 3 feet out from the trunk. And especially if you have a new tree in a location, the turf grass has the competitive advantage. Once the tree is the size of the trees, like what we see here, then the tree has the competitive advantage because it's going to start shading out the tree. So it makes a huge difference on the growth of that new tree. If the further out you're able to mulch it, the quicker it'll grow.
Okay. We do have a couple more questions here. And from Kathy, she asks, if I water a tree due to lack of 1 inch of rainfall, how much water should be provided in the heat of the summer, and how best to apply it? Sprinkler or drip hose or?
So during the heat of summer, it's nice to be able to do drip irrigation for those trees because you're losing less water due to evaporation. But it's a little bit more of a challenge to tell when you're putting an inch of water down. So sometimes what's easiest to do there is to get out a straight-sided can, like a cat food can or a tuna fish can. I don't know if they even do tuna fish in cans anymore, do they? Mostly you see it in pouches. So
I agree.
So you want to excavate below that drip line and put that catch dish underneath the drip, and then just time it. And when you have an inch of water that's gone down in that catch dish, then you know that from there on, all you need to do is time it. You don't want to just lift the line up and put the can underneath it, because the dynamics of how that water will drip from that hose will be very different, and you won't get an accurate reading of how much you've actually dripped an inch down.
Okay.
Another technique that works really well is putting the garden hose on trickle and pretty much leaving it on all day for an older tree like these right here, and just moving it several times underneath the canopy of the tree during the course of the day. And that's going to do a really good job of watering. You're going to get some of the deepest roots watered there. It's an excellent way to water. Oh, and one other thing, the timing. So early morning hours are the best time to water trees.
All right. We do have another question about surface roots on an ash tree, and this person says that about once a year there's a surface root that must be pretty high that they've cut out, and they've done that a number of years and haven't seen any, the ash tree change any. Does it have enough root system that it compensates for that, or do you have a comment about that?
Sure. So if you look at trees that are what we call stream bank species, they grow along creeks and rivers and those kind of places, and those areas can periodically flood and deposit more soil around a root system. Those root systems are a little more tolerant to whatever nature throws its way, whether soil gets washed away from a root system or soil gets deposited on the root system. And so those trees are going to be a little more tolerant of that kind of thing. Keep in mind, though, that there is some things probably going on with the tree that maybe are a little harder to see. And if that's the case, and I don't know if where you are, you have emerald ash borer, but emerald ash borer, if you have any kind of predisposing kind of stressors on that tree, they're not going to be better candidates for treatment because they're not going to take in the insecticides as well. And so severing a root's definitely going to affect the tree's ability to take in some of those insecticides. And so that's a key consideration there.
All right, and I believe this person, it is not in a place where emerald ash borer is yet.
Mm-hmm.
Does it mean it won't be there maybe this year? Maybe.
Yeah.
No. And somebody just kind of made a comment. Why do we still see so many trees that are volcano mulched?
You know, I'm not really sure, other than it's the neighbor seeing what the neighbor does kind of thing. Somebody was telling me one time they taught on a campus and they were watching the campus crew putting all these mulch volcanoes around the tree. And so this particular person went up to the tree and pulled the mulch away the way it's supposed to be. So it was only a couple inches thick, not piled against the trunk. And it was within that very same week that it was repiled there. So it seems like once we get bad information, we just keep going with it over and over, unfortunately.
I have noticed in our community that a couple of the public spaces that sometimes the people that they hire for the summer have had no training.
Mm-hmm.
And so they would just have a job to do and they don't necessarily pay attention to the correctness of the job. So I do think there's lots of reasons we do that.
Yeah. And I was having a discussion similar to that to a parks director one time, and they said that they really like their seasonal help because they really don't look for them to have any kind of skill or talent in a particular area. They just point to the mower and they say, go mow. And so you're right, there's very little training that goes on with those kind of things. And it would be nice to see more grounds maintenance positions that are trained for at the community college level or even at the certificate level for some of these professional organizations like the Nebraska Nursery and Landscape Association.
I don't know, maybe that's something we in Extension need to think about. A quick crash course for somebody who's going to be working in grounds for the summer, the minimum wage. We do have another question. I have traveled a hard surface road through the Lost Hills on my way to Ottawa. I have seen tree roots sticking out of the land due to erosion along the road. Are these trees stable? They look like they would topple over onto the road, especially during a storm.
Yeah, so a lot of times if the soil is either washed away or eroded away or even excavated away, the closer that is to the tree trunk, the more of that root system is probably either dying or dead. And that is an issue. I mean, that is something that destabilizes trees. And we talk a lot in tree risk assessment about how you have to look at the targets around it. You know, is there a house nearby? Are there sidewalks? Is there streets? Those are all potential injury places if a tree comes down. Now, a roadside, a lot of times, no, not necessarily. I mean, it's harder to hit a tree, especially the faster traffic is going. But it is something that should be made. It's something that we need to be aware of. And also, if that erosion takes place very slowly over time, then the tree is recouping some of those roots it's lost. But if it happens all at once, that's way far worse for a tree.
All right. If anybody else does have any questions, please go ahead and write them in. Caitlin, would you come on and tell us about the survey?
Yeah, and
Yes, I sure can.
I forgot to include my email address there, so sorry. If anybody has any questions, they're welcome to email me. It's kcue2@unl.edu.
I just put that in the chat, so.
Thank you.
And I'm noticing I forgot the U on my edu on my email, so I just re-put that in there. If you guys just want to go ahead and copy and paste that survey link over, it's gonna, if you guys were on the morning session, you'll notice that the surveys are identical, but there are two different links, just the way I'm organizing it. So you'll want to just copy and paste that over into your internet browser and just take that survey for us. But if you do have any trouble accessing the evaluation link, you can go ahead and email me and I can email you the link so you can get it easier that way. I think that's all I had, and I didn't see any other questions in there. So just a reminder to go ahead and join us next Friday on the 8th, and we'll be talking about vines and ground cover plants, and then also lawn care 101. So we hope that you guys can join us. Links for that will be posted on the Siouxland Garden Show website and then also on the Facebook page. So we hope to see you next week.
Thank you so much, Kathleen, and have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.